The night she appeared at his gate, the wind carried dust across the ranch like a warning. Caleb Hart was closing the barn when he saw her standing near the fence, a thin silhouette against the fading sky. She looked like she'd walked for miles, boots torn, coat too big for her frame, dark hair tangled by fear and weather. Most people who came to his land wanted something: money, favors, or trouble. She asked for nothing. She only said, "I need somewhere safe for the night." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady, the kind that had already seen too much to waste time lying. Caleb didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. Something in her posture reminded him of wounded animals he'd found caught in barbed wire, quiet, defensive, and ready to bolt. He gave her water, then food, then pointed her toward the small guest room near the back of the house. The ranch had been too quiet since his wife died. Silence had become a habit. A stranger under his roof should have felt wrong, but it didn't. It felt like fate knocking softly instead of breaking down the door. She barely slept that night. Caleb heard her pacing once, then the sound stopped. In the morning, she was already awake, helping herself to coffee like she belonged there. She thanked him with a nod and offered to work for her stay. He shrugged and told her no one stayed on his land without pulling their weight anyway. She smiled at that, a brief, sad curve of her lips that vanished too quickly. Days passed. She fixed fences, fed horses, and kept her head down. Caleb noticed the way she flinched at distant engines and how she always positioned herself near exits. She carried a past like a shadow, never far behind. At night, they sometimes sat on the porch in silence, the kind that doesn't beg to be filled. It was on the fourth evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, that she finally spoke without being asked. "I can't stay long," she said quietly. "If he finds me, you'll be in danger." Caleb turned to her, ready to tell her she was already safe. That's when she whispered the name, low, broken, like a confession she'd sworn never to make. The sound of it hit him harder than any punch. His breath caught, and the past he'd buried clawed its way back to the surface. The name she feared was the one he'd spent years trying to forget. Morning broke with the tension Caleb couldn't shake. The name she'd whispered the night before echoed in his head like a gunshot that never faded. He moved through his chores with restless energy, fixing what wasn't broken, feeding animals that didn't need it yet. She watched him from a distance, clearly sensing the shift. When he finally looked at her, he saw regret written all over her face, as if she wished she could pull the name back into her mouth and erase it from existence. "I didn't know," she said softly when he approached. "If I had, I would have left before saying anything." Caleb studied her for a long moment. The man whose name haunted them both had ruined more lives than the town would ever admit. Caleb had testified once, years ago, and paid for it in ways no court record could capture. Silence had kept him alive since then, yet here she was, carrying the same nightmare, standing on his land as if destiny had a cruel sense of humor. He wanted to tell her to leave, to disappear before the past found them again. Instead, he told her to finish her breakfast. By midday, a black truck crawled along the dirt road beyond the ranch fence. Caleb saw it from the barn loft and felt his chest tighten. It slowed, lingered, then moved on. He didn't mention it, but she noticed his clenched jaw and pale face. Fear recognizes fear without words. That night, she packed her few belongings and placed them by the door, ready to run before dawn. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I won't drag you back into this." Caleb surprised himself by blocking the doorway. "Running never ends it," he replied. He didn't know when he decided, only that the decision felt heavier and more right than anything in years. The ranch had survived storms, droughts, and loss. Maybe it could survive the truth too. They sat at the kitchen table and she finally told him everything. How she'd overheard conversations meant to stay buried. How the name she'd whispered was tied to crimes the town refused to see. How people who talked didn't stay long. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her voice stayed steady. She wasn't weak. She was hunted. When she finished, the silence felt different from before. It was charged, waiting. Caleb stood and reached for the old lockbox hidden beneath the floorboard. Inside were documents he'd sworn never to touch again. Proof he'd once planned to use but hadn't out of fear. He placed the box on the table between them. "If we do this," he said, "there's no going back." She met his eyes, fear and resolve colliding. "I've been running my whole life," she replied. "I'm ready to stop." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a warning, or a promise the trouble didn't wait for morning. Headlights cut through the darkness just after midnight, washing over the ranch house like a searchlight. Caleb was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the lockbox open, papers spread out like ghosts from another life. She stood beside him, heart pounding but spine straight. Fear had followed her for years. Tonight, it would have to face them both. The knock came hard and deliberate. Caleb didn't rush. He closed the box, slid it under his arm, and opened the door to two men who smelled of dust and authority borrowed from someone else. They asked polite questions that weren't polite at all. Had he seen a woman passing through? Did he know who she really was? Did he understand the kind of trouble she attracted? Caleb answered slowly, carefully, every word measured. He told them no. He told them to leave his land. His voice didn't shake, even when one of the men smiled like he already knew the truth. After they left, the night felt thinner, as if the ranch itself was holding its breath. Caleb knew hiding wouldn't work anymore. By dawn, they were on the road, the sun rising behind them as if pushing them forward. He drove toward the nearest city, toward old contacts and dangerous memories he'd hoped never to revisit. The lockbox rested between them like a loaded weapon. When they finally walked into the federal building, the air smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. The woman at the desk looked bored until Caleb said the name out loud, clearly this time without a whisper. Everything changed then. Doors opened. Phones rang. They were led into a small room where the truth spilled out in full. The documents, the recordings, her testimony, all of it laid bare. The weight of it nearly crushed her, but Caleb stayed close, a silent promise that she wasn't alone anymore. Days later, the town buzzed with rumors. The untouchable man was in custody, and people who'd once defended him suddenly claimed they'd always suspected something was wrong. The ranch felt different when they returned, quieter but lighter, as if the land itself had been waiting for this ending. Fear still lingered, but it no longer owned them. She stood at the fence where she'd first appeared, no longer a shadow. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Caleb shook his head. Maybe I did. The past didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. Some nights were still restless, and some wounds never fully healed. But the ranch was no longer just a place to hide. It had become a place where truth finally found the courage to stay. The weeks that followed felt unreal, like life was moving forward while they were still catching their breath. The ranch settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by caution and quiet hope. Patrol cars passed the dirt road more often now, their presence both comforting and unsettling. Caleb noticed how she no longer jumped at every sound, though she still woke before sunrise, watching the horizon as if expecting the past to come roaring back. The town didn't welcome them the way movies promised it would. Some neighbors avoided eye contact. Others whispered behind hands at the feed store. Truth had a way of making people uncomfortable, especially those who had benefited from silence. Caleb felt their judgment like dust in his lungs, but he'd lived with worse. What surprised him was how little it mattered now. For the first time in years, his choices felt clean. She started planting a small garden behind the house, saying she needed something living to care for that. Wasn't running or hiding. Caleb watched her kneel in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, hands steady. There was strength in her movements, not the brittle kind born from fear, but something earned. At night, they talked more, about small things at first, then deeper ones. She told him about the places she'd slept with one eye open, the names she'd changed like coats. He told her about his wife, about how silence had seemed safer than grief. One afternoon, a letter arrived with an official seal. Caleb read it slowly, then handed it to her. It confirmed what they already knew. The trial would be long, and some threats still lingered. Protection was offered, relocation suggested. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. I don't want to run again," she said. Caleb nodded. Then we don't." They made changes instead. Better locks. Cameras along the fence line. Friends he trusted, few but loyal, began stopping by more often. The ranch became less isolated, not by surrendering its peace, but by defending it. She took on more responsibility, managing accounts, making plans that stretched months into the future. Each plan felt like an act of defiance. One evening, as the sky burned orange and gold, she stood beside Caleb on the porch. "You gave me a life," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You reminded me how to live." The wind moved through the grass, steady and calm. The danger wasn't gone, and maybe it never would be completely. But fear no longer decided their direction. The ranch stood firm, not as a refuge from the world, but as proof that even buried truths could take root and grow into something unbreakable.